Okay, everybody, take two. Okay. I do apologize for that initially. I'm going to restart this video. Again, this comes to us compliments of our friends over at DAT. And I really think that it's important to have the insight on kind of where we were in the last, year or two, especially last year, and how that's going to affect us going into 2023, right? What we should expect. And so they're going to pop up some graphs, some data for us to see, and things like that. Guys, you know that I love DAT. If you're not already a subscriber, I do have links in the description for you for your first 30 days free. And then I guess without any further ado, hopefully we won't have any other audio issues. If there is, please let me know immediately before I get halfway into this video to find out. Okay, so here we go.
Okay, so this is how we ended. Sorry about that, the technical problems. As of November, our spot premium ratio is negative 16%. Our new rate differential is negative 4%. And actually, Inam and I were just talking and looking at the freshest data, and it's double digits. It's like 12%. New contract rates coming in are 12 to 14% lower than the contract rates they're replacing.
Again, guys, if you can hear the audio, let me know. If not, also let me know one way or another, okay? Because it was not working the first time around.
Same thing with temp control. And on the bottom, you see the difference between the contract rates, that's in blue, versus the spot rates over 2022. And you can see that inversion point starting in April. What's weird about this, and Inam and I were just talking about this earlier this morning, is that gap. Usually in other cycles, that starts closing a lot sooner. We're actually widening a little bit. So we're trying to see, what does this mean? And we'll talk more about that in a little while. So the question is, why did this happen? So next slide. And so I'll let you jump in on this, Inam, and explain this a little more.
Yes. So purely looking from a shipper's perspective, again, I want to emphasize the fact that this is how the shipper sees. So in the spot rates, it will have the margins already. So what you see here is x-axis is the time, and the y-axis is the line haul rate per mile. The red line represents the spot rate per mile, and the blue line represents the contract rate per mile. The bottom, you see, I had highlighted three events that took place. One is, March of 2020, we had the COVID start. Then in February 2021 was the Texas freeze. And then actually February 2022 was the Ukraine invasion. So these are, some external factors that had certain influence in the market. What you also see, February 2019, June 2020, and April 2022 is what we call inversion of the market, right? So here, the spot rate went below the contract, and in June 2020, we saw the spot rates coming above the contract. And finally, in April 2022, we see the spot rates going below the contract again. And, so overall, one of the things to take away is that the rates, it is a cycle, which we will see again in the next slide. But also there, in each of these markets, so from here, March of 2019 to June 2020, the market behaved in a certain way, which is primarily the shippers market. Then we went into the carriers market from June 2020 to April 2022, and then we are back in the shippers market. Overall, if we compare in the year 2021, we see the contract rate went from about overall average contract rate went from about 221 to 266, a 45-cent increment, which is about 20.3%. And in the same time period, if you look at for the spot market, it went from 289 to 352, 63-cent increment, about 21.7%. Again, this is for year 2021. Now you see from the January 2022 is when the spot market collapsed, and it was as drastic of a drop as what we saw in year 2021, the increase that we saw. So overall, we see a drop up to today, from January to today, on the spot market about $1.23, and which is about 35% drop in the spot market. On the contract side, it peaked out in April. It was in the same level until about May, and then it started dropping. It peaked out about 292 average, and then currently it is 274, about 18-cent drop, 6.1%. So overall, main takeaways is we see the cycles. We saw the unprecedented increase in the years latter part of 2020 and 2021. And the thing that the piece that Chris highlighted is that since April 2022, the market inverted, which is the spot rates below contract rate, and also it is continuing to widen the gap. And if you look at even the last 5 years, we have not seen this kind of behavior where the gap only continues to widen. By now, we would have expected it to start turning around. Anything else, Chris, I missed out?
No, I think that makes sense. But one thing I want to point out is that even where we are now with the contract rates coming down, they will probably never even hit the peak of the previous cycle. What we typically see is that you have this business cycle going on top of a linear trend, which is an inflation rate. And if you go to the next slide, and then I'll turn it back to you, you can kind of see this, where this is a year over year, where you can see that the cycle is very obvious here when we look at year over year trends. But what it's also doing is sitting on top of an inflation rate, which was historically about 3 to 4% up until spring of 2020. And now it's probably going to settle into an 8%, which is about what the inflation rate is for other goods. So I think the big takeaway that I take from this is, one, that this isn't an isolated event, right? These cycles happen,
Yes, and also just to kind of read this chart so everybody's on the same page. So what you see here, as Chris mentioned, it is rate per mile year-over-year percent change. And what we see is that currently the last data point on the blue line, which is contract, you see is negative 2.5%, which means that today's rate per mile is about 2.5% less than exactly a year ago. If you look at the spot rate, it is about 31% below as we compare to a year ago. So everything else, like Chris said, you see the cycles. And another thing also to highlight here is the lag. You see, generally the spot rates is like the precursor, and within generally about 6 to 9 months, you will start to see the contract changing directions. However, one of the things that we were discussing today morning as well is that when the market turned inverted in April, the contract rate was much quicker to respond as compared to what we have seen in the previous cycles.
Yeah, and so the takeaway from this slide is this is something that you guys can use to explain to your CFO, your chief purchasing officer, or to your CEO, anyone in the C-suite, is that spot and contract behave differently. Spot it's like the weather, right? It's going to be constantly very volatile. I'm
going to pause there for just a moment. This graph right here, this data that we've seen from June of 2013 to current, if you notice how that contract rate stays more or less steady, right? And the spot market is so unpredictable. And this, again, whether you're a carrier or a broker, owner operator, this is why I preach it in almost every video, and not to sound like a broken record, but why relationships are so important. Okay? I'll shut up and let them continue. But yeah, this just kind of more or less proves what I've been saying all along.
go faster, be much more nervous, and it leads. It's the canary in the coal mine, the leading indicator of what contract rates. Contract rates are more like the climate. They move a little slower. And so it's like filling up a bathtub. It takes a lot of new race to change that whole direction, because overall, 70 to 90% of all truckload moves go under contract, right? And so it takes a lot to move that, as opposed to spot, which can go anywhere from 10% up to, in the depth of the pandemic, maybe 20, 30% higher on some lanes, but on average. So it's a smaller piece, and so it's much more volatile. But paying attention to the spot rates gives you an indicator of contract rates. But if someone says to you, you know, why aren't my contracts coming down by 30%? I just read on the internet that the spot rates went down by 30%. They're two different things, right? And they're two very different things. They are related, right? It's a leading indicator, but it's not the same thing. Contract rates move slower, more steadily. It's the climate. Spot rates are the weather. But some other things happen.
Sorry, let me jump in there for a second. We do have a question from the audience. What is the spike in spot RPPM prior to March 2019?
I'm sorry, we're saying, what are we looking at?
March 2019.
The question is, what is the spike in spot
There
RPM
wasn't.
prior to March 2019?
The previous cycle? Oh my gosh, that's the cycle of 2018. So that was the last cycle, the constrained market.
mandate.
So we were in a carriers market through 2018, a huge capacity crisis. And a lot of it was attributed to the ELD mandate coming online. There were some other things, some weather effects, but the capacity was exceptionally tight until the beginning of 2019, when the bottom fell out again. So that was the last cycle before the big capacity crisis. That's the last time senior transportation executives got fired, right? When they, that's when the big capacity crisis of 2018. Enam, anything you want to add there?
No, I think that's right. I think
That's the last cycle.
yeah.
Yeah. So other things happen. If you keep going, one more slide. So what happened during 2022 that caused this to happen? Well, there's a couple of things. One is that's just dramatic. Remember we said there were 100 ships waiting off of LA? I just checked earlier this week and the number was 0. No ships waiting, which is normal the way it should be. And so this is showing what's happened here. It's such a dramatic decrease in the number of ships off that. And so that's saying less product is coming in. The backlogs are finally getting worked out, but also there was a shift to the East Coast because, excuse me, shippers aren't stupid, right? You see a backlog and congestion on the West Coast, you start coming into the East Coast ports. So this is the first time that I can recall when there are more ships waiting to unload at Savannah than there were on the West Coast, on LA. And so we were seeing a shifting here, and this is probably going to continue because there's still rumbling about the strike for railroads, might come. And so also West Coast port strikes might happen. And so we're seeing some shifting proactive movement of shippers to move into East Coast ports, which is causing its own kind of problem. But you can see one big thing that happened is the backlog of ships went down. Next slide, please. The other thing is demand got reduced for two things. One is that we tended to shift as consumers from buying products to services, and services don't consume truckload as much, right? It takes fewer truckloads to service $1 in a restaurant than $1 of a good. But also total demand went down, the consumer spending, and that's mainly because of inflation. You can see where most recently we had a slight dip in the inflation rate, I think to 7.8, but we're still at historic levels back to what I'll recall in the 1980s. So this is dampening demand even more. So these are some of the underlying factors that caused a change in the overall market. So we went from a carriers market crazy through 2021 to at the end of Q1, it turned into a shippers market. And it happened with the spot market very quickly. The contract market's just catching up. And you're seeing that starting to crest now. And so the next question is, so what should you do? What did people do differently? And I'll turn it back to you, Enam.
Yes. So as Chris mentioned, when the market goes up and down, like what we saw the cycles, the shippers also learn, how to manage through those bids. With those cycles. And so what we want to ask here is you went through 2021, and again, shippers as well as carriers and brokers, they made changes, appropriate changes to deal with the market conditions at that point in time. So the question we have is, how have you changed your procurement practices in 2022? Again, this may be primarily directed towards the shipper side. And if you're a carrier or a broker, you might know how the shippers reacted to that as well. So please go ahead and answer. The first answer is shorter contracts. We saw mini bids coming through significantly, in year 2021. More frequent RFPs. Next is only include high volume lanes in the RFPs. Using API carriers, for dynamic pricing. And then increase carrier base, so to widen the carrier base.
That poll has been launched, so a few seconds for people to answer. So please feel free to input your response.
While we're waiting for the responses to coming in, there was a question from Anton in the questions, and I encourage you guys to enter in Q&A, and we can respond to these in real time. His question was, seems like the bullwhip effect is getting worse rather than better. How do you account for this considering all the tech trying to smooth out the market? Is it just due to Ukraine, COVID, diesel shortages, etc.? So the bullwhip effect essentially is a common effect in supply chain management where the ordering as I move upstream gets more higher value, gets much more volatile, and it reflects that information is not being shared. So essentially what happened is at the end of 2021, when everyone was short of inventory, retailers and manufacturers tended to overorder. And a lot of times you would order double what you need because if something wasn't going to come through, you wanted to make sure you were covered, and you could always cancel that other order. And so what that does, that leads to the bullwhip effect where humans tend to overorder, and then when things come in, it's below that, we get a shortage. And that's why we're seeing such a drop right now in inventory levels. Why we have such a rise right now, because demand drops so much further than was expected. So I think what we're seeing is the second half of the bullwhip effect. We saw all the hype and of ordering and things, and now we're paying the price. We're seeing that we're left with excess inventory. Anyone who's ever played the beer game in a supply chain course can understand how this is happening.
All right, we're going to share those results on the poll.
Great.
Yes. So as we discussed, so shorter contracts, which is what we saw, and then more frequent RFPs, only including high volume lanes, that we'll talk a little bit more on this presentation as well. Using API carriers, I think they became very viable, especially in the year 2021. Many shippers were open to testing it out. And then increasing the carrier base. That's interesting. That how, especially in today's markets.
Yeah. So Enam, let's talk about those. Can we have those poll results back up? Yeah. So I'm actually surprised by increasing the carrier base, because most shippers that we talk to actually started reducing their carrier base and going deeper in. There's the question for both shippers and carriers: are they elephants or goldfish? Right? Do they have strong memory and remember what happened during the tight market and act the same, or are they goldfish and they don't remember at all and they just go on, doing whatever needs to be done in the moment? And there's a lot of evidence that shippers are elephants and carriers are goldfish. The shippers tend to remember those carriers who are jacking up their rates, maybe not providing the right level of service, and they're kind of shedding them, focusing in on those carriers that might have had rate increases but delivered their service. Carriers, on the other hand, tend to, as a provider, they tend to have to follow that, and they tend to not have memory going back. So I'm actually surprised with the increasing carrier base, because the shippers we've been talking with are kind of honing in and reducing their carrier base to go deeper with carriers. Have you seen anything different there, Enam?
No, I think you're right. The main difference we saw was, especially when the market started dropping and it became a shippers market, the shippers tend to more scalpel approach, right? You're trying to get align better partners, go deeper with your carriers who already served you well in the year 2021. Less we saw in terms of widening the carrier base. So that was definitely a surprise here. But again, it could be a logic where last time we didn't have enough carriers when the capacity tightened. Therefore, we will have a wider base to go further.
Yeah. And so some of the other things that are in there, and I'll talk about this while you get your slides straight. I think we're sharing the wrong presentation. So the other thing that the mini bids kind of rose, and so we saw in 22 is people were doing bids more frequently, every quarterly. Some did them monthly, some were doing them weekly. And so a mini bid is a little different from an RFP. The mini bid is where you try to go in like with a rifle, as opposed with an RFP is more like a shotgun. You try to cover your whole network. And the question is that going to stick? Because it takes effort to run these bids. And so technology has made it a little easier to collect the data and do the analysis, but it still takes a fair amount of time. And the other thing, the analytics that allow you to analyze the bids, yeah, it's gotten better. So you can do more scenarios, but there's an effect there that it's the same thing that happened when the vacuum was introduced to households. People thought that the vacuum would reduce the time you'd spend cleaning, and all it did was increase the level of cleanliness you expected, so the time didn't change. Same thing happens with analysis for this. When you do a mini bid or something like this, because the software lets you look at so many different things and look at thousands of scenarios, you end up doing that. And so the amount of time to do analysis hasn't changed in the last 20 years. Just people do more of it now because the technology is so much faster. So we've seen some of those things with the mini bids. And Enam, what do you think? Do you think the short contract cycles will continue? Or do you think that's going to revert back to that big annual bid and very few things in the middle?
Yeah, I think that's a very important shift that we saw in the year 2021. I think shippers are open to giving shorter contracts for brokers because, again, inherently brokers buy, even though they commit on a contract basis with the shippers, they buy in the spot market. Therefore, that's also the reason why when the market tightened, it was the brokers who went to the shippers for rate increase first before the asset providers. So shippers do need the brokers because that's where the flex capacity comes in. So anyway, the shippers are willing to give shorter term contracts with brokers, but with the asset providers, it's interesting because it is good for the asset providers to get rate revisions, but it is not good for asset providers to take churn because if the carrier churn takes place, because carriers themselves build their own network based on the commitments from the shippers. So if the shippers are churning every more often, then it becomes difficult for the carriers to maintain their own networks. So I think for the carriers, it's a double-edged sword if it is a higher frequency of bids. But for brokers, the shippers are willing to give shorter-term contracts.
Yeah, and a lot of times a shipper will limit. They'll go out to their incumbents first and ask for a reduction or try to secure things before it goes out to the open market. Can you go back one slide? I want to ask one more thing, then we'll lead into this. I was actually surprised that numbers 3 and 4 were not that high, including only high volume lanes in RFP and using APIs. Because one of the things that we discovered, and Enam will talk more about this in a second, is that not all lanes are the same. And I think that more people realize that you have different types of lanes, and maybe you don't want to contract them all, because that used to be the rule of thumb, right? Contract on every lane. I want that contract in my back pocket. And that's becoming maybe doesn't make as much sense anymore. And so with that, let me lead into what you're seeing now, what some shippers are doing, Enam.
Yeah. So what we did was we, by hearing, when you start hearing what the shippers are looking at, we also went back and looked at our large amount of data that we see from a shipper's perspective in terms of lane segmentation. So what you see here on the y-axis, on the x-axis, is the number of weeks a shipper actually shipped, right? So if you're a single shipper, how many weeks did you ship in a specific year? So this data that I have pulled here is from year 2021. So the red line shows the percentage, so the cumulative percentage of number of lanes, right? So let me just kind of pick a point and kind of bring everybody to that. So what you see here, the leftmost point, this point represents that the shipper shipped only 1 week of the year. So the 33%
on that lane, right? You know,
on that lane. Sorry, yeah, once 1 week of the year on that specific lane, right? So if you look at, so in other words, these are infrequent lanes, right? So 33% of the total lanes shipped only 1 week of the year.
Wow.
Right. And then if you go further up, you see that close to 75% of the lanes shipped 12 weeks or less. And then if we go all the way here, you see that close to 85%, right? 85% of the lanes shipped either 26 weeks of the year or less, right? So the flip side of that is, only 15% of the lanes shipped more than that. Now, what's interesting is if you go, the blue line represents the actual spend and the yellow line, the actual volume. So if you go down, straight down to the yellow line, you see that 85% of the lanes shipped close to 20% of the volume, right? On the flip side of it is 15% of the lanes that actually shipped more than 26 weeks of the year represented 80% of the lane volume. And similarly, which from a cost perspective, about only 26% or 27% of the volume was shipped in less than 26 weeks of the year. So what's interesting and important here is to address the question that Chris talked about earlier, is that what lanes do you really want to put out to bid, right? I mean, back in the day, like Chris also mentioned, that we put everything in the bid, and for the carriers and the brokers responding to the bids, thousands of lanes, and nobody can actually, and we know that the carriers and brokers cannot give you very competitive rates on lanes that are not shipping frequently or consistently. So anyway, what we are seeing with the shippers is that they are starting to look at this and ask the question, which lanes and what characteristics of the lanes should I look at before I put that into a contract bid? And how do I address the rest of it, or the less frequent lanes? In the past, when everything was put on the routing guide, whatever fell off the routing guide was handled as an exception. However, the cost of exception in year 2021 was 40-50% above market, right? I mean, when the market was very tight. So what the shippers started to look at it is to say that, what, I will come up with a different plan, not as an exception, but a plan to handle these low frequency, low volume lanes. In that way, I can actually plan for that. So if I go to the next slide.
Gentlemen, can I jump in here with a question?
Go ahead.
Yeah, we have a question for able to address here. How close is the current contract rate to a carrier's average cost of operations? Fine line between profitability and bankruptcy.
Well, I know that Rob could probably answer that question himself, but I think it's getting close there, right? Especially for those carriers that came into the market late, bought expensive equipment, and thought that the spot rates would stay where they were. And so it is getting there. And the real driver for that is the fuel price. I mean, fuel is what, $5.31? Is it a little lower than that? It's above $5 a gallon, which kills carriers, especially smaller carriers, because they tend to buy retail rather than having wholesale for that. Also, a lot of times these small carriers that are buying the fuel, they're operating on the spot market, which doesn't have a fuel surcharge program so they tend to not be compensated as well with the fuel. Larger carriers actually can make money off the fuel surcharge program if their equipment is more efficient than the surcharge equation assumes. So yes, it's getting close to that for some of the smaller carriers, and that's why we're seeing things. We think it's going to level out, right? Because capacity will exit the market. It is exiting the market, and that's what's causing the cycle to come back in balance. But yeah, Rob raised a really good point. We are really close to that, especially for spot rates, and we'll see contract rates, I think, are settling down. We see on average that it's reducing like that. I think it's settling down differently on different lanes. Enam, anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I think the other thing also depends is that how much of the freight that carrier has in the contract markets, because in the contract markets, they're still making a decent amount of money. It is the spot market that they're, the rates have dropped significantly. So again, own operators primarily operate in the spot market, and they are the ones who are primarily paying the price.
Yeah, because contract rates now are on average, this is average across everything, is about 274. It's still about 50, gosh, it's 60 cents higher than the peak of the previous cycle. Now, cost of inputs have gone up, right? So, but we're still way above pre-pandemic levels for contract.
That segues into another question here, actually, from John. How has the driver shortage helped to mitigate some of the imbalance in demand that we see, i.e., less truck capacity due to driver shortage?
I have an opinion on that. I think the driver shortage is something that can be mitigated through more efficient operations. And there's a lot of work being done by a lot of companies to try to improve that. I think it's more of an efficiency problem than not having enough drivers. We found there were tons of drivers available once the prices went up, right? There was no problem finding capacity when they were being paid properly. And so I think it's really coming down to if we can keep the driver driving instead of parked, waiting to unload or load, which they do for probably almost half the time that they're supposed to be driving, I think that driver shortage would go away. So I think the real thing that drove capacity out was what we're just talking about. Price of fuel, so the cost of operating went up and the demand went down. So there was less going into the spot market because the carriers were accepting at a higher primary carrier acceptance rate for the shippers. So there was less demand going into that smaller market. So some people might disagree with me, but I don't think the driver shortage contributed here for this. Enam, do you have a different opinion?
Yeah, I think the only place I think the driver shortage had a larger effect was coming out of COVID, right? I think at that point in time, some who were more closer to retirement took a early retirement, and then the training schools couldn't keep up. So I think that issue I think is largely addressed now. But again, to your point, I think if they're paid right, we will see people shifting into that mode. However, the interests have definitely shifted from a carrier, the driver perspective. Drivers are looking for more regional freight, and the longer haul freight is not the favorite. So that aspect of it is shifting, and therefore the market has to figure out ways to address that.
But let's go back to your lane segmentation, because I think you're going to the punchline here. So essentially this slide is saying that a lot of the lanes carry very little of the volume. It's Pareto in real life.
Absolutely, and the follow-up point for that one is actually planning for those the freight that is low frequent and finding ways that they can efficiently move that as well instead of handling that as an exception.
Gentlemen, we have one more question that just came in here. How will the pending railroad or West Coast port strikes change shipper behavior this fall?
So you know what? I will answer that question once we let Enam finish this slide. Good
deal. So this the overall structure of this chart, there's two charts here, is very similar. So the x-axis is the number of weeks a shipper actually shipped. But the top chart represents that actually how the freight moved. The red is the freight actually moved in the spot market, and the blue is it moved in the contract markets. So what you see here is that even if a shipper put a low frequent, low volume freight out there, it, for example, if it only shipped 1 week of the year, a specific lane shipped only 1 week of the year, 95% of such cases moved in the spot market anyway. If it is 12 or less, 12 weeks or less, then 44% of the volume shipped in the spot market. And if you look at 26 weeks shipped or less, then it 26% of the volume. So you see that on the contract markets starting to make sense only in frequent lanes where the majority of the loads ship anyway. The bottom chart is the opposite discussion of that. Is okay, let's say that you did actually move in the contract market. What's the premium that we see in low volume, low frequent shipments, right? Low frequent lanes. What you see is that if it is a low frequent lane, the difference between the contract to spot was almost nothing. So in other words, even if they gave you a contract rate for a very low frequent lane, they actually gave you a spot rate, which makes sense, right? Because a carrier is not going to position capacity for you if if they can't depend on it. So that's the story of the bottom chart, is that the more frequent, more dependent a specific lane is, it is better. The spot premiums are higher, meaning that the contracts are better than the spot. Whereas if you go to higher frequent lanes into the spot market, then you are actually ending up paying a much higher premium.
Yeah. So the bottom line here.
Go ahead. Sorry.
The shippers are starting to realize that the really low volume things, putting it in a contract, it's a false security. It's like Linus's safety blanket, right? It doesn't make sense. And instead, ride the market with that, because you're going to ride it anyway. So we're seeing that more shippers are turning to APIs or for those low volume, volatile, sparse lanes. Don't even bother contracting. It does two things. One is they get handled better. They're going to go in the spot market anyway, and you're proactively doing that. But second, it makes your bid easier, because you're reducing 60 to 70% of the lanes that you have to include in your bid. So we're seeing a lot of these changes happening with shippers learn from the pandemic, learn from the 2018 capacity crisis, and maybe it's finally sinking in. Anything you want to add to that, Inam, before I answer the question about the railroad strike?
No, I think let's go to the question. I think we made the point here.
Yeah. So railroad strike, if it happens, it'll be a disaster. It'll be horrible. So maybe Congress can finally get together and solve something here. Looks like there's some noise about them trying to do it. There's some brinksmanship going in, and it's going to have a huge impact if there is a railroad strike. So nothing good there. The other thing is the potential strike of the West Coast ports coming up later this year, or next year rather. That could have a big impact as well. And I think shippers are starting to proactively reroute. That's why another reason why the East Coast is seeing more shipping volume than the West Coast. But that's my thought on that. There's also a different question in there about fuel surcharge. And so, Inam, what are your thoughts about this? The question is from Blake. How do you see the different fuel surcharge scales incentivize or disincentivize carriers on the contract side?
I think on the contract side, we see primarily, I would say, three different types. One is standard, which we have been following for a long time. It's like $1.20 or $1.30 base, and then you have mostly now 6.5 cent increment. So that's one group. That's, I would say, still the majority of the shippers handle that on the contract side. Then you have the zero peg. So instead of the $1.20, $1.30 peg, the peg is zero. Generally, the line haul gets adjusted when that shift happens. It's very transparent. And then the third is the breakthrough. So I think the main thing is we have done some analysis. We have not seen any significant. A shipper does not get any significant advantage one way or the other from a line haul rate perspective However, what's important is make it transparent, make it reasonable for the carrier. I think as long as it's transparent, it's not ambiguous, and reasonable, I think, it doesn't make a difference.
Yeah, we did studies a while ago. I've done up here at MIT as well as at DAT, and we thought we'd see a definite correlation, right, Blake? So we'd see that, oh, if someone's very stingy on their fuel surcharge, right, their line haul rates would be higher than someone who has generous program. And we saw no correlation, which was kind of depressing, because maybe it's the people who do the decisions for the rating for the carrier are not the same ones that are dealing with the fuel with the surcharge. I don't know, but we did not see correlations there. Anecdotally, we hear that carriers do not like the breakthrough approach, and they tend to increase their rates accordingly. We haven't seen that in the data, but I get that a lot anecdotally. And so I think to Enam's point, the biggest thing is to be transparent. I know when Zero Peg came out, a lot of shippers thought they could save money by going to Zero Peg, and it's just a transfer. It really doesn't change anything. Anything else on that, Enam?
No, I think keep it published. I think it'll be good.
There are larger carriers do better than smaller carriers because they tend to have newer equipment, which is more fuel efficient. And so a lot of times if a surcharge has a 6 or 6.5 peg, and their equipment is operating at 7 miles per gallon or maybe higher, then they will make money off that fuel surcharge on average. Also, they tend to buy cheaper fuel at a cheaper rate because they can buy it in wholesale or larger quantities than someone buying it at the rack rate. And so there's all these different incentives that you can have there. Larger carriers do better than smaller ones. But let's flip. Let's talk about the future. What the heck? We have 10 minutes left. So go to the next slide. You have a poll going, and we're saying, okay, we've been talking about the inversion of the market happened in April, right? Spot is below contracts, cats and dogs, playing together, all that kind of stuff. When is it going to flip back? And the question is it going to flip back in Q1 of 2023, in Q2, the second half of 2023, sometime in 2024, or never, right? And so those are your options. And so what we're trying to do here is to think about, we look at these cycles, and so we're seeing signals of when the cycles happen. But one of the interesting aspects of truckload transportation is that people don't remember the cycles. And so when things were going up like this, we're thinking, oh my gosh, it's going to go on forever. And now we have rates going down like this. Oh my gosh, it's going to go on forever. And so we tend to default, all humans, into a linear pattern. We think things go in a linear pattern in one direction, and we have a harder time thinking of cycles and waves. And that's the truckload market operates on cycles. And so it will invert back. I'm kind of hinting at that the never is probably not the right solution, the right answer here, but it's probably going to be coming back. The question is when. That's the trick, and then try to figure that out. So Enam, do you have any guesses before we start talking about this and see what the surveys say?
Yeah, I think, well, we've been talking about this. So the contract rates, I think we've been telling, Q2, Q3 is what our expectations are. Even, if the inflation holds on like this, maybe even get pushed a little bit further.
All right, a lot of answers are in, gentlemen. You ready for the
Do
results?
it. The big reveal. Okay. Well, 1% said never. There's always that 1%. You always got that one guy. Okay, so yeah, 2023. The question is when. At first, I thought it was going to be the first quarter, but the gap is just so big there, and I think there was so much extra capacity in there because during the pandemic, shippers were going crazy. There were a lot of one-off lanes going from different things. There's such volatility. You needed the capacity, and the market responded. And now things are back to normal. We're going to see that those get absorbed back in. So I think it's coming, and I agree with the Q2 of 2023. I think that's what it's going to end up with. Hopefully, it won't take till 24, although I know some of you shippers would love to see that market stay that way, but that's not good for long-term sustainability of the carrier base. All right, go back to slides, and I think, there we go. And last slide, okay, here's what our thoughts are of the future. This is from our latest signal report, which gets released every month. And you see dry van, reefer, and intermodal. You see back to 2012. So we have like 10, 12 years worth of data here. You can clearly see the cycles. And so the question is, what's going to happen with the cycle now? We think contract rates are going to continue to drop throughout 2023. But we think we're going to see the spot rates will start coming back up again. And so when will that invert? We're thinking in Q2, but there's a lot of variability. Who knows? Putin might invade another country. You never know what's going to happen there. On the reefer lanes, you see the same kind of thing happening. It's moving a little slower. Reefer tends to move lag a little bit for dry van and intermodal. It looks like it's a dramatic drop, but it's still way above pre-pandemic levels. And this is our forecast going forward and where we think things are going. Enam, anything you want to add there?
I think just for the intermodal, we are assuming that, they are not going to hold out. So, that is a big assumption in this particular case.
Yeah. All right. So I think we're done with slides. And so we can just answer. I think we have some more questions. We have a couple more minutes left.
Yep,
Jeff,
we
do you
do
want me
have
to just
the
read them or
questions.
do you want to read them out?
Yep, I'll take one for you.
Okay, so we've kind of gave a little bit of a history lesson, and I do apologize. It was a little bit lengthy, but they really kind of broke that down over the years and sort of reinforcing that bullwhip effect that we tend to see, that so many of us tend to forget about. And then again, looking at the data and kind of what it's telling us where we should be, Q2, Q3 of this year, we should start to see a little bit of an uptick in the spot market. They are predicting that contract rates will go down. They mentioned earlier about shippers, went from like yearly contracts to quarterly contracts or monthly contracts. That's something that we saw absolutely within the last year. It was I could think of one shipper in particular. We had turned in our RFP for the entire year, had that in place, and at the last minute they decided, hey, if you still want this lane, we're going to end up making it quarterly, which was really kind of a hold your breath at the end of every quarter to see if for not only myself but for my dedicated carrier, right? So we kind of had to adjust to the market through 2022 for that particular customer. But again, I think no matter what side of the table you're on, whether you're a broker or a carrier, it's important to build those relationships, especially whether you're in the spot market or you're running primarily dedicated freight. It's always important. But yeah, if you guys have any comments, any questions about this, those of you that stuck with me, I saw there's some fluctuation in the numbers there. Some people, I know, again, I apologize for it being a little bit lengthy, but I also felt it was important to kind of show all of that previous data and where it brought us to date, right? And then what we're looking at the future. Again, guys, this is brought to you by our friends over at DAT. If you don't have a DAT subscription, because they do provide all this information free, right? Again, I've got a link for the 30 days free at DAT if you don't already have it, as well as links to other resources, whether you need factoring and things like that, companies that we stand behind. So I guess with that, it is getting kind of late. It is about 10 after 9 here. I meant to get this done earlier, and my colleague, my buddy Devin, I actually meant to have him on, but he's feeling a little under the weather today, so he wasn't able to make it. But I do hope to have him on a next video or a future video. So I appreciate everybody that watches, subscribes, and shares. Without you, we wouldn't be where we are today. And I love doing this. I love sharing this information. Again, this is sort of my way of paying it forward to everybody because, I started out years ago and when I first got started, I needed that insight, that help from others. And there was only a few that were willing to give it. And otherwise, I still wouldn't be here. And so I hope you find the information that I post and everything helpful. With that, as always, be kind to one another, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye now.